Slight change of gears now. We are going to talk about the goals and targets of a central bank. What has everybody heard of the US Fed? What's the Pakistani equivalent? Yeah, so this is the central bank. In Pakistan, that's the State Bank of Pakistan. In the US, it's the Federal Reserve. Short form for the Federal Reserve is simply the Fed. In the curriculum, you'll see a lot of verbiage on what the Fed is all about. If you are interested in it, go for it. But from an exam testability perspective, the key points are listed right here. What are the goals of the Fed? Given that this is the US exam and the US textbook, they focus on the US central bank, but a lot of things that they say here are pretty general. The goals of the State Bank of Pakistan are very similar to this. Okay. Now, typically, what's the most important goal of a central bank? It's to keep inflation low. And in fact, our, Mr. Dr. Kardar, one of the reasons he probably left was his main mission was what? To try and control the money supply and keep inflation rate low, which was not suiting the government. So there was a clear conflict. But one of the fundamental objectives of the State Bank of Pakistan is to keep inflation low. And if you read the financial press, very often the justification for why the central bank is increasing rates is given as, we are increasing interest rates because we want to control inflation. Anyway, so for you to memorize from an exam perspective, one of the first points is that a goal of a central bank is to keep inflation low. Then the next one obviously is to promote economic growth and full employment. But very often these goals are somewhat contradictory in the sense that when you try to keep inflation low, you might be hurting economic growth. But for most central banks, this comes first. So they try to do both, but for most central banks, controlling inflation is more important. Then the second one is to promote economic growth. What does economic growth mean? You try to increase your GDP, your unemployment you want to take down, and so on. And then smooth business cycles. What do smooth business cycles mean? That over time, if you have your this is your time, and this is GDP, this is not a smooth business cycle. You have lots of, overheated economy, big recession. So rather than have something like this, there will be business cycles. What a good central bank will try and do is keep these cycles as low as possible. So economy doesn't get overheated. So at this point, they control inflation, and at this point, they minimize unemployment. So this is the third objective.
So it will be only these likely goals of the
Yeah, if possible. Yeah, so then it will be. Yeah, so then it will be this. Yeah. Okay. Now, the Fed targets what's called the federal funds rate. What's the federal funds rate? The federal funds rate is essentially the rate at which banks lend to each other in the short term. Yeah, essentially it is like KIBOR. The bank does not directly control that rate, but it tries to influence it through mechanisms that we will talk about shortly. Okay, I'll just make a minor clarification at this point, and we'll see this on the next slide. A lot of people get confused between what's called the federal funds rate and a number called the discount rate. The discount rate is the rate at which the central bank will lend to banks. So the central bank can say exactly what the discount rate is. So in Pakistan, I believe the number is currently something like 14%. So this means that if any bank goes to the central bank for a short-term loan, the central bank will lend at 14%. Typically, the federal funds rate will be very close to this number, but I just want you to understand the distinction. On my website, by the way, I have a small article that just clarifies all these, interest rate terms. Okay. Then there is this federal. You also need to know that for the State Bank of Pakistan or the Fed, what does their balance sheet have? So obviously every institution will have a balance sheet. What are the assets don't spend too much time on this, just as long as you know these points. What are the assets of the Fed? They are, any treasury securities they have, gold, foreign deposits, loans that they might have made to banks. These are their assets. And what are their liabilities? The notes or currency that are in circulation, and any reserves on deposit. Reserves on deposit means that banks need to have a certain amount of reserves. What does bank reserves mean? When we put our money in a bank, that's our deposit. What does a bank do with that deposit? The bank takes that money and gives out loans. But if we put $100 in a bank, can the bank give out all 100 in loan? No. It has to keep a certain reserve. Let's say 15%. So that 15% it either keeps with itself or it puts in the state bank. The state bank is the bank for the banks. Okay, so the central bank is the banker to the regular commercial banks. So the deposits so the reserves for a regular bank are deposited where? In the central bank. So from a central bank perspective, that is a liability. Why is that a liability? Because it's, for them, who's the depositor? For the State Bank of Pakistan, the depositor would be HBL and National Bank and so on. Okay. The next point is, what are the policy tools used by the central bank? And broadly speaking, there are three, two of which are listed over here. The one that is used most often is the open market operations. Okay. So the one used most often is open market operations. And again, you will see this over and over in the financial press. What's the open market operation? Open market operation is where the central bank either buys or sells treasury bills, government bonds, government securities. Okay, so when the central bank buys government securities for cash, so when the central bank goes into the banking market and it buys T-bills from the bank, what is it doing? It is injecting liquidity into the market. So you will often read in the business recorder or in the Dawn, economic segment that central bank injects liquidity by purchasing T-bills worth whatever 50 million rupees or something. So what has the central bank done? When the central bank buys T-bills, it has injected cash into the market. So when it injects money into the banking system, that obviously increases the money supply, and then more loans can be made and so on. And what if the central bank sells T-bills? When the central bank sells T-bills, then it is sucking liquidity out of the market. So then it is taking cash away from the banks and giving them the T-bill. So this is the most commonly used method for a policy tool by the banks. Why? Because by controlling the central bank uses open market operations to, in a sense, control the money supply. And as you will see shortly, by controlling the money supply, the bank can control the federal funds rate. And I'll say this now and I will repeat it later. The central bank can either control the money supply or it can control interest rates. It can't do both at the same time. When it is controlling the money supply, that automatically influences the interest rates. And that's what typically happens, I'll show you why. Okay. Another policy tool is something called the required reserve ratio, and this is seldom changed. Okay, so I'll say this is number 1, this is number 3, and number 2 is actually on the next slide. So used most often is this open market operation. Every week or 2 weeks, the central bank will be doing a open market operation. Required reserve ratio changes very often. How many people here know what the required reserve ratio is? Okay. So for everybody's benefit, I'll just explain it in very, very simple terms. Going back to the example I just did, when each one of us deposits 100 rupees at a bank, the bank is then, what would a bank like to do? How does a bank make money? The bank makes money by lending that money out. So ideally a bank would like to lend out as much of it as possible. If the bank takes 100 from us and hopes and prays that we don't come and ask for that money back, and it lends out all 100, what's the positive of doing that? The bank can make more money because the more loans it hands out, the more money it makes. But what's the negative? The negative is very risky, right? Because if they lend out all the money and then we start going to the bank and saying that give us our money back, and the bank says I don't have any money, that's the worst possible thing that can happen to a bank. Then what happens is called a bank run and so on. So the worst thing that can happen to a bank is the thought that they don't have enough money to give back to depositors. So how do we address that problem? In very simplistic terms, the banks are required to keep a certain amount of that deposit. So if the required reserve ratio is 20%, just to pick a number, if it's 20%, that means that for every $100 deposit, the bank has to keep 20. Now that 20 could be either physically at the bank or at the bank's account at the state bank, but the required reserve ratio is how much the bank must keep. Okay. Now, how is this a policy tool? If the required reserve ratio is 20%, which is a relatively high number, then does that encourage more liquidity or less liquidity? That encourages less liquidity in the sense that banks are being forced to keep more money themselves and make less loans. If the required reserve ratio is reduced to 10%, what is that doing? If the required reserve ratio is reduced by the central bank, that is encouraging more liquidity. But what's the cost? The cost is potentially higher risk in the banking system. All right. Okay. And then the second most important tool, which is used roughly every quarter. So both in the US and in Pakistan, there is a committee within the central bank that meets and decides what the discount rate should be. And those of you who follow the press will see that, so in Pakistan, every quarter or every 2 quarters, this committee meets and decides whether to keep the discount rate the same or increase it or decrease it. Over the last few years, the discount rate has been gradually moving upwards, and currently it's at a fairly high number of 14%. So as I mentioned earlier, the discount rate is the interest rate member banks pay the Fed, or in our case the SBP, for borrowed money. By raising the discount rate, the Fed discourages banks from borrowing reserves, thus encouraging them to reduce their lending, and this reduces money supply. Okay, straightforward point. Decreasing the discount rate tends to increase the money supply for reasons that should be fairly obvious. Now, one more concept, then we'll take a short break. How does a bank, or how does the banking system create money? There is a nice big picture in the curriculum, which if you have time you can go through, but I think as long as you understand this basic example, you are in good shape. So in a fractional reserve system, what does a fractional reserve system mean? This is the system I just talked about, where each one of us deposits money in a bank, and a fraction of what we deposit is kept by the bank as a reserve, and what happens with the remainder? That is lent out. So this system is called the fractional reserve system for obvious reasons. In a fractional reserve system, a bank is required to hold a fraction of its deposits in reserve, and this fraction is the required reserve ratio which we just talked about. Let's look at an example. If a bank receives $1,000 in new reserves and can loan out 800 because the required reserve ratio is 20%. So when it receives 1,000, how much must it keep with itself? 200, which is 20%, and 800 is then loaned out. Okay. Now, before I go on, what was the basic definition of money? Just keeping it simple, what was the definition of money? One definition of money was M1. What did this include? This was the cash or currency with consumers, and what else? Deposits. Okay. a few other things like cashier's checks and so on, but these are the main points. I just want you to refresh this in your memory. So whenever we say money supply, just think very simplistically that money supply means the cash that we have and our deposits fundamentally. So now let's see what's happening to M1 or money supply. When a bank receives $1,000 in new reserves, let's say that this was injected by the state bank, and then when they loan out, so they loan out 800 in loans. So when they loan out 800 to somebody, so somebody else now has that 800. So with that 800, they take that money and deposit it somewhere else at a different bank. So are more deposits created with that same $1,000? Okay, and then that bank keeps 20% of 800 and loans out 640 to somebody else, and that somebody else again goes and deposits. So do you see this multiplier effect? That initial $1,000 is given to someone, so he creates a deposit of 1,000. So has money supply gone up by 1,000? Yeah, because the deposit was created, a checking account, let's say, was created, $1,000 went into the checking account, so money supply went up by 1,000. Then from that 1,000, the bank could lend out how much? 800. So let's say 800 went to businessman B. He put that money in his account. How much did he put in his account? 800. Did money supply go up by 800? Yeah, M1 went up by 800 because that's a deposit. And then does the bank need to keep all 800 or does it only need to keep 20% of that? It keeps 20%. What happens to the remaining 640? It goes to businessman C. And then he creates a deposit. So do you notice this, this huge effect? So just because $1,000 enters the system, does that mean that money supply goes up by 1,000, more than 1,000 or less than 1,000? It goes up by a lot more than 1,000. And that's the critical point. By how much more does it go? By how much does money supply increase by? And there is a mathematical proof that you don't need to be, as in that you don't need to learn. If you really want to know it, we can discuss it later after the exam. But for now, all you need to know is that the potential increase in money supply, and I'll tell you why I say potential. Potential increase in money supply is 1 divided by the reserve ratio. Okay, if the reserve, just intuitively, if the reserve, actually first I'll do this and then talk about the intuition. So what's the reserve ratio in this example? 20%. You always write it as a decimal. So this is equal to 5. What is this saying? This is saying that there is a multiplier of 5, which means that when $1,000 are injected, potentially there is a $5,000 increase in money supply. Now intuitively, if the reserve ratio were lower, 10%, then would the multiplier be higher or lower? What exactly will it be? 1 divided by 0.1, which is 10. So the lower the reserve ratio, the higher the multiplier, because we can have more and more money created. So that's essentially what we've been talking about. Money is created when there is a loan and a deposit. What are factors which, so I'll do the slide and then we'll take a break. What are factors which limit the quantity of deposits that the banking system can create? Okay, one is the monetary base, and I want to give you a very, lots of people get confused by this. The distinction between monetary base and money supply. What we have been talking about so far, things like M1 and M2, is that money supply or monetary base? Yeah, what we have been talking about so far, things like M1 and M2, is the money supply. This is the first time I'm actually formally introducing the concept of monetary base. What is monetary base? In very simple terms, there are more strict definitions, but very often the best way to learn something is to understand what is the core essential definition of a new term. Monetary base is simply the physical dollar bills or the physical coins. So the total money, actual hard money in the society, that is the monetary base. Okay, so think of it as the amount of rupees printed in our country or the number of or the amount of dollars in the US. So that physical amount of currency is, in simplistic terms, there are some subtleties around it, but the essence is that the physical currency is the monetary base. Now, all we are saying is that the higher the monetary base, the amount of the monetary base is one variable that influences how much our money supply will be. Okay, we don't need to get into details of exactly how it happens, but intuitively, if you just have a total of $100 in the society, will the monetary supply be high or low? Obviously, it will be low. So clearly, you can see a link, that there has to be some link with how much physical currency there is and money supply. And that's all we are saying, that one of the factors which has an impact on money supply is the monetary base. What? Yeah.
So you said that higher the monetary base, then the money supply would be
higher.
So now what's the
देखिए M1 में अभी हमने क्या बताया था, very simplistically again, M1 में क्या चीजें होती, so the cash with depositors, cash with people, and say deposits, and the deposits, does the monetary base include deposits? No, that's huge difference. That's the big difference. Okay.
So the subset of money.
You can think of it as a subset can create a misleading impression. The better way to think of it is, it's the base or the foundation on which money supply rests. It will always be less, if that's what you mean. But monetary base, think of it as the base or the foundation on which the money supply will rest. And in more tangible terms, the specific distinction, and this was a very good question, is that money supply can become pretty big because it covers deposits. Right? So if she gets 100 and loans 80 out, and then you create a deposit, the money supply is increasing, but the monetary base is not increasing. Okay, but clearly how high the monetary supply or money supply can get in some way depends on how much the base is. Okay, and then how big the money supply becomes, do you think it depends on the reserve ratio? So if the reserve ratio is high, then what impact will that have on the money supply? Low. We've just talked about that. And desired currency holding, this is another important term. So what's the desired currency holding? Now, in my simplistic example so far, I simply assume that if you get 800, you are businessman B, you get 800, then you put that entire 800 in a bank. Will that always happen, or do you think you might keep some at your home? You might keep some. So in fact, if you put less money back in the banking system and keep a lot of money with you at home, what is that doing to the money supply? It's reducing the money supply. Why? Because if you are not putting money in the banking system and you are just keeping it with yourself, then the money obviously is not being used to create further deposits and so on. So if the currency holding in our society, so in Pakistan, for example, the desired currency holding is very high. A lot of money sits outside the banking system. And if a lot of money is sitting outside the banking system, that means the desired currency holding is high. So what does that do to money supply? It reduces money supply, because then you don't have loans and deposits and so on. Okay. There is this specific term that I will tell you, and then we will continue this thought after the break. The specific term that you need to know is the currency drain ratio. The currency drain ratio is currency divided by deposits. So the point is that if the amount of currency, the amount of currency that you keep, so I'll just say currency divided by, no, this is a different term. This is your desired currency holding. So this is a different term. This term, just understand the philosophy of the logic here. The term here is that so desired currency holding is a measure of how much currency people want to keep with themselves versus depositing. Okay, so if you are in a society where currency is high, which means people like to keep a lot of cash in their pockets, and deposits are low. So what will the desired currency holding ratio be? it will be a high number. So if this is a high number, what's the impact on money supply? The impact will be money supply will become lower. Okay. Now anyway, hold this thought. We'll take a break now. We'll resume in 15 minutes. So we'll start at 12:45, and I'll take this concept, do some examples, and go forward. Okay. So we are back online now. Actually, some of you asked this question about how does the currency drain ratio impact the money supply. So since two people asked the question, I'm assuming others might also have a similar issue. So we've already talked about two numbers here. We've talked about R, which is our required reserve ratio, and in our example so far this was 0.2. So this required reserve ratio of 0.2, what did this mean? This means that when a bank receives $100, it will keep 20% or $20 and can loan out the rest. So that is the R, or the reserve ratio. Then we talked about this other concept of the currency drain ratio, which we will call C. Currency drain ratio is a measure of how much money is drained out of the banking system. So to understand this intuitively, a currency drain ratio of 0 would mean what? This would mean that nothing gets drained out of the banking system. Nothing would make the senior bankers in our country happier than having C equal to 0. What would this mean? This would mean that people are not keeping money in their pockets and their drawers and so on. They are putting all the money back in the banking system. The other extreme is what? C is equal to 1. What does C equals 1 mean? C equals 1 means that when you get money, you don't put it in the bank. The whole money gets drained out of the banking system. So now I just made a statement that when C is high, that reduces money supply, which strictly speaking is not, I would rather, a better way to state this would be a high currency drain ratio reduces the multiplier effect. So two of you have heard me say this. For the rest of you, just to understand the point, let's first take a scenario where C is equal to 0. So is this good or bad for the banking system? This is actually good for the banking system. Okay, those who said bad need to listen more carefully. Alright, okay, yeah. Why is it good for the banking system? It is good for the banking system because when, going back to my example, let's say that you are businessman A and you get $1,000. Okay, a currency drain ratio of 0 means that when you get that $1,000, you take that whole $1,000 and put it in the banking system. When you put it in the banking system, what happens to, so is that a deposit? That's a deposit. What happens to money supply? Goes up by 1,000. Okay, now since the currency drain ratio is 0, so bank takes 1,000, and what does it do with 1,000 given a reserve ratio of 0.2? What does the bank do? So the bank actually then can loan out 800. 800 goes to person B. So person B has 800 with a currency drain ratio of 0. What will person B do with that 800? He will put it in the banking system. When he puts it in the banking system, what happens to deposits? Goes up by 800. So what happens to money supply? Goes up by another 800. Same monetary base. Did anything change with the monetary base? Nothing. The monetary base might just have been that the state bank printed $1,000 more and put it in the system. So monetary base went up by 1,000, but money supply has already gone up by how much? It's already gone up by 1,800. Now the 800 that is in person B's account, what will let's say that person B is UBL, or he puts his money in UBL. What will UBL do? So they will then loan out 640 to person C. And if the drain ratio is 0, what does person C do? Puts the entire 640 back in the banking system. So now, so he creates a deposit of 640. What happened to money supply now? So it's now gone up by 2,000 something. Okay, so and so on and so on and so on. So when you have a 0 drain ratio, the multiplier is very high, and the multiplier that we just talked about, the 1 over R, is basically 1 over 0.2 and your multiplier is 5. Now let's take the other extreme just to illustrate the point. Other extreme is what? Other extreme is that the currency drain ratio is 1. When the currency drain ratio is 1, this means that the first businessman, let's say, got $1,000. Drain ratio of 1 means what? So that means that he keeps that entire $1,000 at home. Did money supply go up? Money supply went up. By how much? By 1,000. Remember, money supply, core definition was money supply is your cash at home, not in the bank, plus deposits. When you get 1,000, you have 1,000. If you are keeping it at home, did money supply go up? It went up by 1,000. But the drain ratio of 1 means what? That drain from where? Drain from the banking system. So if the drain ratio is 1, that means $1,000 did not go in the banking system. So if the money did not go in the banking system, did we create any more deposits? Did we create any more loans? No. So money supply went up, but by just by 1,000. There was no multiplier effect. So the more precise way to state the impact of the drain ratio is that when there is a high drain ratio, that reduces the multiplier. And to make it even more specific, the formula that you need to memorize, and you don't need to know the derivation. The good thing about the CFA is, in general, you don't need to know all the derivations. You just need to memorize a bunch of simple formulas. So I would advise you to start creating a simple formula sheet. And in the economics segment, this can be one of your formulas. So the money multiplier, what is the money multiplier when C is equal to 0? So as I've shown you already, when C is equal to 0, your multiplier is simply 1 over R. When C is non-zero, then your money multiplier is 1 plus C divided by R plus C. So you can do a few simple examples. Let's just do this one together. So if your monetary base is 1,000, so that means that $1,000 were printed and injected into the economy. Will the monetary base go up or not? It will go up. How much it will go up depends on the drain ratio and the reserve ratio. Is that logical? So can you do this calculation very quickly? By how much will the money, so what is the money multiplier? So the money multiplier in this is very simply 1 plus 0.5 divided by, what is R? It is 0.1 plus 0.5. So this is simply 1.5 divided by 0.6. So this is 2.5. So notice that when you have a currency drain ratio of 50% or 0.5, what does that mean intuitively? That when people receive money, they keep half and put half in the banking system. So the drain ratio is 50%. Half the money is drained out of the banking system. What did that do to the multiplier? So notice that with a drain ratio of 0, the multiplier was 5. And with a higher drain ratio, the multiplier is lower. So that is 2.5. So everybody with me on that? Okay, good. So this is an important formula to put on your formula sheet. And what, the advice I'll give you right now is start doing this now. Create for every topic, create 2 formula sheets. One formula sheet will have the most important, high value formulas, and the other sheet will have the more complicated formulas which are less likely to be tested. This would go on your high value formulas, which is more likely to be tested. Then this sheet will become very helpful when you do your revision. Okay. Now let's look at the demand for money. We've seen this briefly before. Demand for money depends on interest rates. Okay, so let's look at the demand for money. What's the y-axis? It's the interest rate. What's the x-axis? It's the quantity of money. And as I've said before, interest rate is like the price or the cost of money. So when interest rates are very high, then people will demand less money. When interest rates are low, then people will demand more money. So just you have a simple downward sloping demand for money, which is like any other demand curve. That's point number one that you should know. So how do we move up and down the demand curve? You move up and down the demand curve if the only thing that is changing is the interest rate. And what causes the demand curve to shift? You can just keep in mind two factors. If there is an increase in real GDP, so if the output of your nation is improving, then you can just think that the demand for money, demand for capital will also increase. What does increase in GDP mean? More production, more things happening. So obviously then the demand for money will go up. And generally speaking, if there is a decrease in real GDP, then the demand for money will decrease. So the demand curve will shift to the left. And financial innovation can have either effect of increasing or decreasing the demand curve, but the effect that has been seen more often that the demand for actual money goes down. A simple way to think about it is when you have facilities such as credit cards and so on, then potentially your demand for money goes down. But this is not a 100% relationship. This is just the way you can just memorize the fact is that financial innovation is more likely to cause a reduction in demand for money. Don't need to go too deep into this. Okay. Now, if you recall, one of the points I had made was the government or the central bank through open market operations can control money supply. Okay, when the central bank, how does central bank inject money into the system? It injects money into the system by buying T-bills. When the central bank buys T-bills, it's injecting money into the system. So money supply. So at any given point in time, the reason you see this money supply, so this is your straight line at quantity Q. So this is your money supply line. So it's a vertical line at a given point in time. You have this, this amount of money supply. And then the downward sloping demand curve is your money demand or demand for money. Interest rate, which is the price of money or the cost of money, is set based on the point where the money supply and money demand meet. So the way you can think of it is the central bank cannot control the demand for money, but they can control money supply through open market operations and its other policy tools. What were the other policy tools? The discount rate and reserve ratio. So you've noticed that by changing the reserve ratio, can the government or the central bank change the money supply? So when reserve, just to check your understanding, when reserve ratio goes down, what happens to money supply? Money supply goes up. So the point is that the central bank can influence this money supply. So if the central bank is doing its job, it should know what the demand curve is. And then if it has a target of say 8% rate, what can it do? Can it change the demand curve? Not so easily. Can it change the supply curve? What is the most common way of influencing the supply curve? Yeah, so the most common way is through open market operations. What are the two other ways? One is changing the discount rate and the other is this. But the most common one that happens almost every week or every 2 weeks is the open market operation. So let's understand this picture a little better. Let's say that you are in this zone where there is, so let's say interest rates here are high, 10%. At 10%, there will be an excess supply of money. So notice here that at 10%, the supply of money is more than the demand for money. Then what will happen? If the supply of money is more, people will buy bonds, and you will understand this whole concept of bonds later. So if there is an extra supply of money, people with that extra money will buy, let's say, government bonds. When people buy bonds, what happens to the price of bonds? Price of bonds goes up. This is something when we do fixed income securities, you will see in a lot of detail. For now, just take it as a given. When the price of bonds goes up, interest rates go down. If you don't understand this relationship right now, you will understand it very well when we do fixed income securities. Right now, just take it as a given. So if there is excess supply of money, what do people do with that money? They buy bonds. And when the price of bonds, when people buy something, what happens to the price of that thing? Goes up. When the price of bonds goes up, the interest rates go down. So for now, take it as a given. And the opposite happens if rates are low. So if rates are 6%, what's more, supply or demand? So then the demand is more. If the demand for money is more, how do people get money? By selling bonds. When people sell bonds, what will happen to the price of bonds? The price of bonds will go down and the interest rates will go up. Okay. Quantity theory of money. In the long run, an increase in money supply will cause a proportional increase in prices. So from an exam standpoint, you need to memorize the fact that the one-line definition of the quantity theory of money is this. Okay, that in the long run, an increase in money supply will cause a proportional increase in prices. What's a simple intuition behind this? And people in Pakistan can relate to this very well. Do you think the money supply in our country keeps increasing? So every time the central bank, on instructions of the government, keeps printing more money, what's happening to the monetary base? When the monetary base is going up, as we just saw, what's happening to the money supply? Increasing. So when there is more money circulating in our economy, chasing the same goods, is the amount produced in our country changing? The goods and services, that's not changing so much. So if you have more money chasing the same goods and services, what will happen to prices of goods and services? It will go up, right? So that's a simple intuition. Whether or not it is proportional, one can debate. According to this theory of money, the relationship is completely proportional. But whether or not you 100% subscribe to this theory, it is obvious that if you have more and more money chasing the same goods and services, price levels will go up, right? So that's fundamentally what this is saying. Then we try to just create some formulas and relationships. The GDP, or the output of a country, how much a country produces or how much is consumed in the country, is equal to the money supply. So how much money there is times velocity. Velocity is how often the same unit of money is used to buy stuff. High velocity means that the same money is used to buy stuff very often. Low velocity means that the same money is used to buy stuff infrequently. So just take this as a given. One way of expressing the GDP is that the GDP is equal to the money supply into the velocity. Another way of expressing GDP is it is the price levels times real output. So in nominal terms at least, if so again just take this relationship as a given that GDP is equal to price level into real output. Now if you combine these two equations, what we are saying is money supply into velocity is equal to price level in times real output, and commonly used symbols, money supply is often written as M, V is written as V, price level is expressed as P, and your real output is often expressed as Y. So then notice what's the formula for P. So P becomes M into V over Y. So what this is saying? What this is saying is over the years, V remains fairly constant. The rate at which you use money to buy stuff remains constant. If the real output Y, how much you think that's been changing in Pakistan in the last few years? Not much. So this doesn't change too much either. So the core relationship here is that if you are constantly increasing money supply, this thing in the circle is more or less constant, then the rate at which money supply increases will also be the rate at which price levels increase. So then monetarists, so these are economists who subscribe to the quantity theory of money. So they will say that to maintain price level, you should increase the money supply at the rate of growth rate of real output. So what they are saying is that if you want to maintain prices, is maintaining prices a good thing? Generally, it's a good thing, right? One of the largest issues in our country, even politically, is the issue of inflation. So what do monetarists say? Monetarists say that, okay, our output might be growing at a slow rate, but we should increase money supply at the same rate as Y. Now, if velocity is constant and if money supply is increased at the same rate as the Y, what's Y? The output. So if the output, the real output of what's real output? So these are the real goods and services produced by our economy. Let's say this is growing at 5%. So if our real output is growing at 5%, they say that money supply should also grow at 5%. Then what will happen to price levels? Then the price levels will be stable. So this is what the monetarists would say.